Hey, it's Christian. So, Jonathan Pageau, Symbolic World. Um, I first encountered Jonathan Pageau later than Jordan Peterson, obviously, but it was still pretty early on. I saw him having conversations on Jordan Peterson's podcast, and um, at first I didn't really get him, uh, which he's a Christian, but, he's Orthodox um, and the conversations that he was having with Jordan Peterson, because on one hand, Jordan was talking, kind of scientifically and psychologically, but then when he would start talking to Jonathan, it was about kind of strange things. And for my kind of Protestant, mm, Baptistic sensibilities, I think it was a stretch for me to get into that space. I kind of had to find a door in. And I think one of the things, Jonathan, I could kind of tell after listening to several talks that he didn't seem completely orthodox. Like I could kind of sense, and the way that he had insight into, I guess you could maybe say like evangelicalism, in a way that made me think that he wasn't just like a cradle Orthodox person. I don't know what they call them, cradle Catholic or a, ordained ortho. I don't know, but he, so I could sense these sensibilities when he would kind of talk. He at least appears pretty ecumenical. He's not like an ortho bro that's out there. This is the one true church. Whether he believes that or not, he doesn't lead with that. It's obvious he finds the most meaning in that space, and it's where he has his icon carving artistic endeavors out of. So that's where I kind of I could sense like this connection in that way. And I think I later found out that like his parents, or he was a missionary at one time, and I'm sure it wasn't necessarily like in the Orthodox Church. So myself, and then I connected to him through, I guess maybe I'm kind of what is in like the creative category. You could say I'm a musician. I was a musician by trade for a large part of my life, and so the way he talked about like worship structures in churches, and that was all very fascinating to me. And I began to kind of map some of my own experiences onto that, because he wasn't just like philosophy or theology or psychology. He was in this kind of image and in a spiritual realm, maybe in a lot of his language. So I was curious why he was connecting to Jordan Peterson, and what Jordan was finding so interesting in him, because I was kind of getting the Jordan Peterson stuff. And when you look at even the title, though, of Jordan's, magnum opus, which was the Maps of Meaning, the big tome that it is, Maps of Meaning, Symbolic World, like I I kind of see how those things start to connect, how meaning, when Peterson starts to talk about how meaning is nested in story. Well, what is story but this kind of almost metaphysical idea, and how those things are much more at home in the religious structures. And I would say, which I don't know a lot about Orthodoxy, but it's all about symbolic and religious structures intentionally preserved over a long period of time, and how there's like meaning in almost every aspect of what you do in the Orthodox Church. So I remember I had a conversation. One of the first pastors that I worked with at a church, this kind of, vanilla evangelical church, his parents, who had worked for like a evangelical ministry, had converted to Orthodoxy later in life. And I was like, what's that all about? And we never talked about it a lot, but he gave me some examples of how, like, even how they hold their fingers when they're doing like the sign of the cross, like, has meaning. And I had a situation even as a nurse where a patient was sick and likely going to pass, and they were Orthodox, and I saw the priest come in, and the patient's wife like bowed down in the middle of our ICU, and and he had some box with him. I'm sure it was for some blessings and whatnot, but I was seeing these things, and they impacted my mind about Orthodoxy in that way. And coming from a Protestant and evangelical perspective, I was having a conversation recently with a friend, and it really is like in the Reformation, a stripping away of images, a stripping away of actually a lot of meaning. And that so much of then the faith becomes an intellectual assent. And I kind of am rejecting that in a way, because so much of modern and Protestant religion is all about what you believe, like assenting to the right beliefs. And I don't want to get like heretical. I like being a part of like a confessional tradition. I value that. But even in Lutheranism or other churches, there's still a lot of high regard for symbols, and whether that's sacrament and even just robes, or how a sanctuary is built. And so that's where I've started to really connect with Jonathan Pageau on symbolic meaning. And he gets very broad in how the structure of reality is tied up in these symbolic structures with hierarchies. And that was actually another connecting point, was Jordan Peterson. He's talking about lobster hierarchies and natural hierarchies, and Pageau is talking about symbolic structures that are basically types of hierarchies. And that's where another piece where they were creating some synthesis. And I feel like the world wants to deny, the buzzword of patriarchy, all these archies and blah, blah, blah. But it wants to deny that things are bottom up and top down. It wants to be one or the other. And so as on this journey of developing meaning in my faith or religion and my life, kind of viewing structures that have not only symbolic meaning but literal meaning in life. You could look like at the family structure, or a religious structure, or a governmental structure, or whatever. But then we also have things that like represent, like archetypes that represent different kinds of places in the structures. But for me, in my background, a lot of it had to comes into, and with my experience, into like gathered worship for churches. And so that's been more on how I've integrated a lot of his ideas. And not that I've had a lot of chances to integrate that, because I haven't really been doing that kind of ministry very much in a long time, but that's where it's created meaning in maybe how I choose to participate in religion with my family and things like that. So, for instance, like how a Christian calendar can have a lot more detail or a lot more emphasis in your life than just, say, Christmas and Easter, where, there's Advent, and then even from the Christmas season goes on past the day of Christmas in different traditions and the more traditional traditions. And you can carry that into your life and create meaning and purpose in your religious gatherings and in your, creating purposeful times that you spend with your family. And that has created meaning, more deep meaning in my life. And it's, I consider myself kind of lucky in the sense that my wife was raised in a more historical tradition, because things like Lent and Advent were normal for her, where for me as a Baptist, those were seen as like Catholic, and tied to rote religion and that type of stuff. So we've been able to integrate that and create sacred structures and sacred practices in our home. And I feel like our world, when we talk about the meaning crisis, something as simple as like prayer before a meal, that was in a more hegemonistic culture that we once were as the West, or things like that maybe aren't practiced by families nearly as often or as normal, create a rhythm and a moment of sacred reflection. And of course, there's sometimes it's just nothing, but you are shaped by simple things like that. And another piece of this is a friend of mine who came to my church years ago that I used to go to, and he had come out of the Catholic Church, not because he'd married a person who was a woman who was Catholic, and he had come from kind of evangelical church, and he always talked about his experience in the church being like a candlelight dinner with Jesus. And I was like, man, what are you talking about? That's interesting. And I think, what is a candlelight dinner? It is purposeful, it is planned, it is special, it is, there's candles, there's romance, there's, all these things. And you kind of can envision a candlelight dinner. There's like a classic idea in your mind, tablecloths and a butler or a waiter or whatever, and the cloth and a tuxedo. And so I don't know. And I think the other piece that comes to mind with worship and church and meaning in that way is in the conversation, in the recent, and I have been doing a lot of recent current event type things, but Daily Wire put out this series with Jordan Peterson going through Exodus, and Jonathan Pageau was a part of that. And there was a lot of the going up to the mountain and the coming down for Moses, and what that's like, symbolically meant, what it psychologically meant, what it theologically meant, and even the story of Abraham when he encounters, the Trinity or whoever it was, and he's like, let's build tents and stay here, because this is just so wonderful. That these traditions that we have they map onto these symbolic structures of like high church, low church, and they exist for a reason. And this was the conversation I was having with my wife actually today. We were talking about these things and about like church worship, and she came from like a very traditional Lutheran church that had, if you understand what consubstantiation is about the communion, it's a high view of what's happening and what's taking place, and there's kneeling, and there's a priest or a pastor administering the sacraments, and it's often, and the gathering itself is other. It's not like kind of just this. It's not a folksy thing. It's an other space, a holy space, sacred space. And then you come from me where it was like casual dress and rock music and dancing. I don't dance like that. I mean, I dance, but I don't not in church. And there's this high up, and then there's this low, and they are represented, and you see them both represented in Scripture, and even in times of worship, you have the David dancing in the streets, undignified, and then you have the Holy of Holies that we can't even walk in the Ark of the Covenant, and how do these two things coexist, and are they both real? And I think they both play a part, but I think it's a problem ultimately that the churches they kind of miss each other. Like okay, so I'm coming from this low thing, and she's coming down, and then I don't know. It's interesting, but those structures are powerful structures in our life, and like having, especially as like a young person, having these undignified experiences of rock music and energy. You have a lot of pent up energy, and then you go into a space that's saying like, sit up straight and don't talk and be quiet, and I can see how they don't, at different seasons, aren't as beneficial, aren't as meaningful. And so there's a temptation, I think, in the movement towards the trad bros and all those and the things like that, to walk away from the low to seek the high. But at the same time, there was, it's a backlash from all of the high and the boomers coming down to seek the low because it was so stuffy they couldn't breathe. And I want to care for both people and see both people, and I don't know where I kind of land in all that, but Pageau is a part of helping me process those things. And I guess the last piece that I'll say about that is growing up and being told that the image of the crucifix was an evil thing because Jesus isn't on that cross no more. He's not on that cross. He didn't stay on that cross. And that's true. I mean, I believe that. But I also believe that he was on that cross. And in different seasons of my life, in painful seasons of my life, I feel understood or cared for or seen by God who was on a cross. And there's other times that we need to see Christ as victorious and victory in our life and the King and the overcomer. But there's also the time that he suffered. So those are also high and low images. So yeah, I'm going to try to start saying, leave a comment, hit subscribe, all those YouTube-y things, and let me know your thoughts. All right.